Hello, ladies and gentlemen, gabestah here. Welcome to Golem Hell. This is a guide for heroic dark Animus, and as you probably know by now or have heard, this fight is incredibly difficult, easily the most challenging encounter of this tier that we've faced, and it's very possible maybe worse than heroic Legion, although we'll see. Anyway, so this fight is all about figuring out the puzzle at the start before you even engage based on the setup of the room and your raid composition. There are a number of ways to go about this encounter, so I'll talk about a few options for your strategies and overall tactics that you'll employ. And then we'll talk about specifically what our group found to work best and what you see in the video. So let's get started. So your raid composition for this fight will vary wildly depending on your strategy and your raid makeup, the players involved, the strength of your healers and your tanks, all that good stuff. So it can go from anything from one tank and one healer if you're doing a complete Zerg strategy, all the way up to 3 tanks and 3 healers, and pretty much anything in between is also viable. So I will just talk about, as we discuss strategies, talk about the various compositions that might fit those, rather than a set composition that you'll want to use. I will say briefly that the composition we finally settled on after trying a variety was 2 tanks and 3 healers, which you see in the video clips here. This offered the most stability while also giving us the DPS required to get through the difficult aspects of the fight. So, with that, let's move on to the next section. Also, a brief note before we get deeper in the guide that was important on normal and is still important here is the terminology used to describe the encounter. This can be confusing because the term anima essentially describes 2 different facets. One, it's the actual energy of the anima that they gain, but then anima also describes the actual golems that you face, since they're all named some variants of anima golem. So, for the remainder of the guide, I will refer to the anima energy as simply energy, and then the actual golems as either golems or anima golems. So that should hopefully clear up the confusion there. Okay. The first big change on heroic is that Dark Animus will activate right away, and he starts off with 52 energy. However, the first siphon, unlike on normal, is delayed for 2 minutes on heroic, at which point it will occur every 20 seconds as you're expecting it. So the entire encounter revolves around the notion that Dark Animus starts with high energy, but you have this 2-minute period to set up the puzzle pieces as best you can before the siphons begin. Because once they start, you need to limit the amount of energy he gains. And of course, we'll talk about this in the strategy section, but that's the basics of it. So the second change on heroic is the addition of the Empower Golem ability. And this is used by Dark Animus about every 15 seconds throughout the encounter. This targets the current active golem, any type, with the least health at the time. So this can be on a small golem or a massive golem. And when it is applied, it's a stacking buff that increases the total damage output of that golem by 24%. As well as heals the golem for 3% of their total health. So a pretty minor heal, but essentially it acts as a forced way to increase the damage of the golem that's targeted. And this ability will later on in the fight apply to your massive golems, which of course will increase the damage that they do to the tanks and through slams and all that stuff. Whereas early on the fight, it's usually cast on the smaller golems that you have active around the raid. So it's not a major ability to worry about, but it does present some minor tactical changes in terms of handling that. So we'll get to that when we get to the strategy stuff. So one more brief note before we get into the strategies. The ultimate goal here, when you're about to kill Dark Animus, the setup that you want to see is Dark Animus is active and 2 massive golems are active. So on the top left there, you can see the distribution that you'll see at the end, ideally. The energized targets, those with actual energy, are Dark Animus and the two massives. Then you'll have 6 non-energized large golems on the sides of the room. And then the dead things that you've killed by then will be all 25 small golems plus 2 large golems. So if you see this setup near the end of the fight, then you know that you've done most everything right up to that point. Now, the timing of when you did things is important, of course. We'll talk about that in strategy, but this is the ultimate goal. What this allows you to do is to limit the drains or the energy that Dark Animus gains every time he siphons. He will only gain 2 energy when there are only 2 energized targets, of course, the 2 massives. And that's the end goal here. So you can delay his energy gain to a rate of 1 energy every 10 seconds at the end of the fight if you have that set up. And that's what you're going for. Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty of the actual strategies here. So, to discuss the way you distribute the energy throughout the encounter, we'll need to discuss the possible ways to do it from the most optimal and then down to the least. So here you can see a table that will show you the perfect execution. This is the maximum energy distribution method you can use. What this means is that this is the way for the fight to last the absolute longest possible before 100 energy is gained by Dark Animus. So along the left, you can see the number of seconds that have elapsed. Since there isn't a siphon before the 122nd or 2-minute mark, that's when the first siphon appears at 120, and then it's 20 seconds after for each siphon. Then you can see the energized column shows the number of energized golems that are active during that time period. So before the first siphon, there's 25 possible energized targets. It's all 25 of the small golems. And Dark Animus's energy is represented in the energy column there. So he starts at 52, and then you can see each section below that after a siphon, it will show you the energy that he'll be at if you've done the proper activity. So for the first 2 minutes before the first siphon, the goal is to kill 6 small golems and distribute their energy into 3 inactive large golems, the 3 inactives on the side of the room. You also need to kill the other 18 out of 19 small golems and distribute those energies into the 2 massive golems. Each massive can hold 36, which of course is 4 times 9. So you kill 9 small golems into each massive to maximize their energy. So after siphon number 1, number 2, and number 3, there are no further changes if you did everything prior to that before the first siphon. However, after siphon 4, that will mean that the 2 massives now have 4 energy drains, so they're at 32 of 36 total. And the 3 inactive larges also have 4 energy drained at that point, so they're at 4 of 8 total. So after siphon number 4, you can then kill 2 of the inactive large golems near the 2 massive golems and distribute the 4 energy from the larges into the massives. Again, consolidating the energy is the goal here. So after siphon 5, there's no change. And then siphon 6, you can kill the final inactive large golem, which will now have 2 energy total, but the massive golems will also be 2 energy down from their maximum. So you could theoretically consolidate that final bit of 2 energy from one of the larges into the massive. After that, no other energized targets exist except for the 2 massives and Dark Animus. So the timing is simply 2 energy every siphon is gained by Dark Animus for the remainder of the fight. So ultimately, what I hope to illustrate by this perfect execution chart is that if you look in the bottom left, you can see that the total fight length that you have before 100 energy is gained by Dark Animus is up to 400 seconds, which obviously is a long time. For example, our first kill on this, which was quite sloppy, we had a couple deaths and everything, was only 5 minutes. So that's 300 seconds out of 400 potential. So we had nearly 2 more minutes that we could have squeezed out if we did a perfect execution method. So essentially what this means is that is that once you get the basics down at the start of the fight and you do everything at the proper time, the actual length of the fight is quite forgiving, and it becomes more a matter of execution and survival than it is about massive DPS or anything like that. So here's another chart to just show you an example of a near perfect method. So the only difference between the perfect execution and this one is that we ignore the final inactive large golem that we killed at Siphon 6 on the perfect execution method. Instead here we're just letting it go because it's only got 2 energy, and so that 2 energy that would have been distributed from a large into a massive instead is drained by Dark Animus at the rate of 1 energy per siphon. So over 2 siphons he soaks up that energy. If you look at the total seconds in length before 100 energy at the bottom there, you can see that this is 380 seconds of fight length compared to the 400 of the perfect execution method. So what this essentially illustrates, I hope, is that if you do most things correctly on this fight, the actual time lost from a near perfect or perfect execution method for every energy that Dark Animus gains is essentially 10 seconds. That's the best way you can think about this fight when you are setting it up, is if Dark Animus gains an energy that he should not, that is 10 seconds of lost potential fight time at the end of the fight. So you subtract that 10 seconds off of the 400 theoretical for every energy he gains that he shouldn't, and then you can calculate approximately how long that fight will potentially last. So this gives you a good sense of where you can afford to make cuts in your overall strategy or have energy gains that might not otherwise be optimal, but still have enough time for the encounter and still get through it safely. And this is a really important factor. When I was considering this fight originally, it seemed logically to my brain that energy gains early on by Dark Animus were worse than energy gains made later. But the truth of the matter is, as long as that energy gain doesn't bring him over a certain threshold, such as 75 or 100, the energy gain early on doesn't make any difference if it's early or if it's late. He will gain it eventually. So as long as you give yourself enough time before he reaches 100, you don't have to worry about that. So this is really important when you're learning this fight. Okay, move on. So the final energy distribution example I want to show is when you ignore all large golems. So essentially, once again, you do everything at the opening perfectly, so that massives are all full energy before the first siphon, and therefore the number of energized golems will be 6 on the first siphon, because you have 3 larges, 2 massives, and then the 1 saved small Anima golem, which we'll talk about later. So what this means is if you look at the energized column and the energy column after siphon 4, you can see that the energized number of golems for 5, 6, 7, and 8 siphons is 5 total golems. Whereas if we had killed the 2 inactive larges after siphon 4, as we did in the previous examples, the number of energized would be 3. So the energy rate that Dark Animus gains energy and this setup is extremely high. And that means he gets to 100 energy at the 300 second mark, compared to 400 seconds if you do a perfect execution, or even 380 seconds if you do a perfect execution but ignore the third inactive large. So the lesson here is simple. If you fail at nearly everything else in terms of energy distribution on this fight, the one thing you have to do correctly is kill and soak the 2 inactive larges after siphon number 4. If you fail to do that, the fight length potential will be much, much shorter than it would be otherwise. So keep that in mind. So the first possible strategy I'll just briefly mention is the Zerg strategy. And I would not recommend this method at all. We did try it, and it just doesn't seem like a good way to go. But for completion's sake, I'm including it here. The basic idea is that you kill Dark Animus and ignore all the mechanics of the fight and try to kill him before he kills you. Now to do this, he essentially will cast 2 siphons before you're going to die. The first siphon after the 2-minute mark will get him above 75 energy, so he'll jolt you after that first siphon. And then the second siphon, he will gain full power, at which point he will quickly kill the raid in another 10 or 15 seconds. So you essentially have about 140 seconds to kill the boss. With 288 million health, this means that you have to do about 2 million raid DPS. So if you're using one tank, they'll be tanking Dark Animus plus probably 3 smaller golems and keeping these golems active for high vengeance. And then you'll use 1 or 2 healers. So with 2 healers, all your non-healer players, including your tank, have to do 257,000 DPS over the course of this 140 seconds. If you're using 1 healer, it'd be 228,000 DPS. So both of these are extremely high numbers for most players. And again, I do not recommend this because most groups that are just getting to Dark Animus, trying to progress on Heroic Dark Animus, are probably not going to have the gear or the DPS to meet this requirement. And you could waste a lot of potential time trying to get this method down when it's just not really viable. So I strongly recommend another strategy that's just more about stability and doing the fight as intended. But, you know, if you're confident in your DPS, you think you can meet those numbers, then that's really the way to do it. Just ignore everything, have everyone tank an ad or 2, with the tank getting the boss plus 3 ads, and then just try to kill him before he kills you. So the second possible strategy is the most stable method in terms of survival for your raid, and this is essentially using 3 tanks. Now, in spite of what Blizzard has suggested, that 10-man methods will never be better with 3 tanks again, this is one of those cases where that's not necessarily true. 3 tanking is the go-to method for 25-man, for example. Obviously, you know, the sacrifice of adding 3 out of your 25 players for tanking roles is pretty minor compared to the increased survival and stability that it offers. And this is much the same in 10-man. You can choose to do 3 tanks here, and it will be a lot easier for your tanks to stay alive, for your transitions between the massives and the Dark Animus, and all that stuff. So the basic idea here, I'll get into all the specifics of how you actually kill things and pull and all that stuff in the next strategy section, because they apply to this one as well. You can refer to that if you need to. But the basic idea is that one of your tanks grabs Dark Animus, and then one tank grabs the massive on the right, and another third tank grabs the massive on the left. The 2 massives should be activated not at the exact same time. If you delay them about 10 seconds apart or so, then the matter swap casts from the massives will not overlap, and this will be really important for survival for your healers and your ranged and whatnot. Once the massives are active and each on an individual tank, the tank simply drags them along the respective side of the room, killing off all the small golems that are either still active on players or the inactive ones that are on the edges of the room. Each massive should gain the total 36 energy by the time they're done on the respective side. So make sure you plan out exactly which small golems are going to be killed by which tank, so that, you know, there isn't a leftover on one side or the other that one tank has to move over and get. This should be easily accomplished before the 2-minute mark when the first siphon occurs. So since you have maximum control for your tanks, they can activate their masses pretty early. So the easiest thing to do is to have each tank 2 or 3 of these small Anima golems and kill off one of them quickly to activate the massive. And then they can start the drag on either side after that. And that's pretty much it. Once the massives are full and all the small golems are dealt with, and you get the first siphons beginning, then your tanks simply have to do a rotation between the massives and Dark Animus. So just like if you're using 2 tanks, you swap Dark Animus and the massive on one of the tanks when the explosive slam stack on the massive tank gets too high. So then you just swap with a Dark Animus tank, and once the explosive slam on the new Dark Animus tank drops, then that player can swap with the oldest massive tank and just keep going in this 3-player rotation over and over until the fight ends. That's pretty much it. So again, I'll talk about more details about the overall pulling methods and how you kill things and where you stand and all that in the next strategy section. So for strategy 3, this would be a 2-tank method, and you can use 2 or 3 healers. This is the setup that we ultimately settled on as the best, and it's of course what you see in the video here. We decided to use 2 tanks and 3 healers, and essentially the idea is that the 3 healers offers a lot more stability for your raid, and even though you're using 2 tanks, so you have a little bit less stability on your tanks themselves compared to 3 tanking, the extra healer sort of mitigates that quite a bit, and then you have pretty good DPS overall as well. So if you're choosing between, say, 3 tanks and 2 healers, or 2 tanks and 3 healers, I would strongly recommend that 2 tank, 3 heal is the better method. It offers more overall stability for your raid, but it of course requires that your tanks to be pretty good and know exactly what's going on and can react and all that stuff. So with that, I'm going to rewind to the start of this fight and play it back really slowly, and then we'll go through the actual step-by-step process to pulling off the opening for this 2-tank method. So as we loop back to the beginning, you can see the playback speed is slow here, and at the bottom is the step-by-step guide for the actual execution of this opener section for a 2-tank method. So your Dark Animus tank obviously starts with Dark Animus, and they also grab 1 active small golem, which they'll pretty much hold, and we'll talk about that later. The massive tank will pull 3 of the active small golems and tank them near the massive they want to start with. So there at the top you can see our paladin tank is our massive tank, and he pulled 3 of the active small ones, and by doing this, these all obviously gain the stacking buff for being close together, and thus they do an extreme amount of damage to the tank. So make sure that tank uses all their survival cooldowns, as well as any outside cooldowns you might have available to help survive. The good news is that because their vengeance will be so high, they're going to very quickly kill off those active golems. And once those 3 active golems they start with are dead, that tank then takes the massive along that side of the room and kills off the closest 6 inactive golems that it should be predetermined, such that when they reach the last inactive golem, small golem on that side of the room, the massive that they started with is at full 36 energy. At this point it can be taunted by the other tank that's on Dark Animus, and then the massive tank can move over to grab the other massive and do the same basic method. So we'll talk about that in a second. Meanwhile, as you start the fight, you have 8 active small golems that are still unaccounted for. So 6 of those active small golems should be assigned to your DPS and or healers, and all 6 will be killed near the 3 inactive large golems around the outside of the room. Obviously 2 of them per inactive large golem. So the actual distribution among your DPS and healers will depend on your raid composition and whatnot. But for example, what we did is all 5 of our DPS, since we're using 3 healers and 2 tanks, each get 1 active small golem, with the exception of our Shadow Priest, who actually tanks 2 active small golems. So he has 1 of them attacking him from the front and 1 attacking from the back. This way they're not too close together and they don't gain the stacking buff and kill him. So other than that, every other DPS kills their single active small golem near their assigned large golem, inactive large golem, and distributes the energy to the inactive large. After that's done, then the only remaining active small golems are 2 more that are assigned to your healers, essentially. So you'll have 2 of your healers with 1 golem on them each. So you may have seen at the start of the fight, I had 1 on me for a while, and that was one of the 2 extra that we had going around. And these should be DPS'd but not killed, so that they're low health, 10 or 20%, but then left at that mark to be used later by your... So once that first massive reaches full energy, at the time that it kills the last inactive on its side of the room, the Dark Animus tank taunts it. So there you can see our monk tank that's on Dark Animus taunts the massive as our paladin runs past. And then our paladin picks up one of the extra active golems that were on the healers there. So he grabbed the one that was on me and runs over to the massive. Now, activating the second massive timing is important. You want to activate it approximately 5 to 10 seconds after a matter swap has gone out on the raid. By doing this, this will stagger the matter swap casts throughout the rest of the fight so that you don't have matter swaps overlapping, which it can be very problematic. So he basically just waits for that matter swap and then another 5 seconds or so, and then activates that golem. So you can either kill the active that he taunted off me or just the inactive that's near it. Either way, activates the second massive, and now he just drags it along the appropriate side, once again killing off all the inactives on that side. By the time he reaches the end and he's killed off the one active that he pulled off me, plus all the inactives, the massive will be at 32 of 36 energy. At this point, the massive tank taunts the active golem that is on the Dark Animus tank, which at this point should be around low health, 20% or so. So there you can see the active in the top left. There's kind of a nameplate for it on our Dark Animus tank. So it's now taunted onto our paladin, and he will kill that off as the final energy gain for the second massive. And this will bring that second massive to 36 energy as well. Thus, the only remaining active golem, besides the massives, is the small guy that was on the other healer, in this case our druid healer. So your Dark Animus tank should then taunt that final small active golem and hold it for the remainder of the fight until it deactivates on its own. If you did all this correctly, and within the 2-minute time frame before the first siphon, then the number of energized targets, that is targets with energy to drain, will be 6 in total. 2 massives, 3 inactive larges, and the 1 single active small golem that's remaining on your Dark Animus tank. And this will mean that the first siphon will cause Dark Animus to gain a total of 6 energy, so he'll be up to 58 at that point. So if he gets his first siphon off and he's at 58 energy, it means that you did everything perfectly for distribution and getting, the fight going from that point on. And that's really the first key step, is getting this opening section down. So again, it depends a great deal on your massive tank primarily, as well as the rest of your raid to kill off their targets in the proper locations and quickly get in position for things like matter swap and all that. So here we'll just finish off this clip again. You can see the second half briefly again, where massive tank is killing off all the little guys, dragging the massive with him. And then once he gets to the end, he'll taunt that final the second to final active small golem off the Dark Animus tank and kill it off to give it the final energy boost. From this point forward, it's just a matter of your tanks swapping as appropriate for the massives based on their slams. So this depends a bit on whether you have a paladin tank that can bubble the debuff off or not. But the basic idea is simple. Once the second massive is full energy, then that tank will taunt the massive off the Dark Animus tank and either bubble if they're a paladin to refresh reset their stat count, and then they can hold the 2 for a while, or they'll simply hold the 2 for a few more seconds until the Dark Animus tank has dropped their explosive slam stack, at which point then a normal tank swap occurs, where the Dark Animus tank taunts both massives and the previous massive tank grabs Dark Animus. And this process is just the same one that repeats throughout the the rest of the fight. So the next step occurs after the fourth siphon, essentially. And this is, as I mentioned, the energy distribution section, where you need the massive tank to tank the massives near the two large inactive golems on the side and kill them off quickly so that their energy goes into the massives. So the best thing we found for this was actually to do a tank swap around the time of the third siphon so that the new tank that's on the massives has essentially reset their explosive slam stacks. So that tank has about 20 seconds after the third siphon to taunt both the new massives. The other tank grabs Dark Animus, and then that tank can be in position around the time the fourth siphon hits to quickly kill off the two large inactives. So here you can see the fourth siphon is coming up. So our tank, who's our monk tank now, that's on the massives, is dragging over to the large. And once that fourth siphon hits, which it just did there, now he's going to kill off that first large inactive. And once that dies, quickly move over to the other one and kill off that one as well. And so that's pretty self-explanatory. So you have about 20 seconds, obviously, before the fifth siphon in which to do these two large massive inactive golems. So should be enough time to do that. One thing that's important to note is that you want to make sure that your massive tank, who's out on the edge there killing those larges, is not a valid target for matter swap during this period. So the best thing you can do to help yourself is to make sure matter swap targets, that is players that actually get the debuff on them, move to that side of the room where that massive tank is standing at the time. And that way they'll be guaranteed to teleport with someone that's on the other side of the room and not from the far side to the tank and vice versa. So that's the best thing you can do. The other thing you can do is have someone that's further away than the massive tank is, but I wouldn't recommend that. It's a lot more painful. So essentially just make sure the massive tank is not swapped when they're moving out to the edges there from matter swap. So those are the two big points here. The opener before the first siphon, getting all those golems dead so that Dark Animus only gains 6 energy for siphon number 1. And then after siphon number 4, killing the two large inactive golems into the massives. If you've done both of those successfully, that's it. You don't have to worry about anything else. You'll have 380 seconds out of 400 possible to kill the boss before he reaches 100 energy. You'll also have a jolt after the fourth siphon, so then you can expect them every siphon after that. And otherwise, the fight does not change at all from the beginning to the end, really. So, yeah, that's the basic core of this strategy. Once you get that stuff down, then the rest is just a matter of practice and tweaking it. So another important consideration is how you handle matter swap. And just like in normal, this teleports the current target of matter swap with, generally speaking, the player that is furthest away from them. However, we've noticed that matter swap has a maximum range that it will teleport with. The actual yards I'm not sure of, but I would estimate about 60 yards or so. So that means that, in theory, two players on opposite sides of the room, one with matter swap, will not be swapped with the other player. They'll be swapped with someone closer. So, to deal with this, as well as just the general idea of swapping with someone opposite you without causing too much trouble, you can see here this very beautiful top-down diagram, thank you very much, of the room and how we distribute matter swaps, essentially. So you can see on the left, the green is the green raid marker that you'll see in the game itself. On the right is the blue one. And then the yellow dots are just the random ranged or healer players that we have in the raid. So obviously the number you have will just depend on your raid, but it doesn't really matter. The basic idea here is that Dark Animus and the melee, along with the massives, are generally in the center of the room, around the circle. And then the red bar there is the sort of lined, grooved area that's going across the center of the room. that you actually see in the fight itself. What this means is that our range throughout the fight, once we're done with the opening and they're all just on Dark Animus, as well as the healers, try to stay within this grooved area of the room on either side of the boss. And we do this distribution somewhat evenly. So we'll have, since we're using 3 healers, and otherwise we have 2 ranged in this video, we have 3 players on one and 2 on the other at any given time, for the most part. That way, if a matter swap targets someone on the left, for example, they don't have to do anything to automatically be swapped with someone on the right, and therefore not swap with someone that we don't want, which would be a tank, for example, or a melee, something like that. So, generally speaking, players can remain in their overall position regardless of whether they are the swapper or the swappee. And then once they swap with someone on the opposite side, if it's 2 DPS they get swapped, they can just stay where they were. That's fine, you know. You're just on opposite sides now, and you can just keep DPSing the boss. If a healer gets swapped with another healer, again, you can stay on the opposite side that you were swapped to. It doesn't matter. The only thing that might need some finessing is if the side with one healer gets a swap with a ranged DPS. Because that way you'd have 3 healers on one side, and you can't have that. You have to make sure that you have a healer within dispel range of both sides at all times. So that's the only time that things can be troublesome. The other thing to watch for is if a melee gets matter swap targeted on them, they simply stay in melee range of Dark Animus, but move on the left or the right side. It doesn't really matter which side. And then they get dispelled from within melee range. But since they're, again, furthest from someone that's on the opposite side within this grooved area, then they just get swapped with a ranged player. So, pretty simple stuff. And that's it. So, the focus is less on the actual target selection of matter swap and more on the overall positioning, so that by always being within range of 1 to 2 healers, no matter who the player is that's targeted or getting swapped, we can easily heal them up after the matter swap or before jolt hits and that kind of thing. So you can mess with having particular players always be the swap targets if you want. A lot of players use warlocks for their innate damage reductions, but we just found that wasn't worth messing with. And in the end, it was more about allowing higher DPS, stationary positions for the most part, and then just always being in range of a healer or 2 so that you could be healed and dispelled easily and quickly. The last mechanic to really discuss on Heroic is Anima Ring. Just like in normal, this is cast on the Dark Animus tank, and touching these orbs increases the melee damage that player takes by 50% in this stacks. So it's extremely important that your tank does not touch that on Heroic. If they get 1 stack, they can survive with cooldowns and a lot of healing, but it's far from ideal, and even then sometimes the tank will just die really quick. So make sure you have someone that can handle Anima Rings. Probably one of the best classes for this is a rogue. The reason for this is because the Anima Ring itself on Heroic does damage over time. It applies a stacking dot that does essentially 180,000 fire damage over 15 seconds per stack. So the reason a rogue is good is not so much to mitigate the stacks as to mitigate jolt damage, so that the combination of jolt or matter swap plus the dot will not kill you. That said, if you don't have a rogue, there's no reason that pretty much any other class can't do it. Just make sure you prioritize someone. Generally a melee would be better since they're going to be in range anyway, that has some form of damage reduction that can be used during jolts or matter swaps, that kind of thing. So otherwise, just assign the 1 player to always get the rings for your tanks, and if that player happens to be matter swapped right as a ring is coming out, make sure they communicate immediately so that another substitute player can quickly step in. So in our case, our rogue did the vast majority, but if he could not step in, he would call out, and our DPS warrior would then pick up the rings for that temporary time. And that's pretty much it. So as long as you handle rings properly and just deal with the dot damage, then there's really nothing else going on here. Also, Anima Font is ridiculously annoying and deadly on heroic. You'll essentially have font spewing out at all times. There's also an overlap of about 5 seconds for every 30-second font duration, where you'll have 2 fonts going at once. Now, font tends to target players that are nearest to the player that has the font active on them. So in some ways, you can actually control this by forcing certain players to be nearest the font target. However, because font can target anyone in the raid that has the touch debuff on them, it's very difficult to really get a system going that forces font where you want it at all times. So ultimately, I would not suggest trying to do something like that. And instead, it's going to be mostly up to your raid members to dodge fonts throughout the entire fight. And this is something that can be very difficult to do. So the best thing to do, absolutely, is just move constantly. If you're always moving and you kind of move in a short little pattern, a lot of raid members would sort of dance in a square or back and forth between 2 locations, then you'll never be at risk of a font that's being cast on you actually landing, because you're moving to a new position basically every time it comes out. If you can't always move, then the next best thing is simply to watch your feet. You can see the graphic as it's landing, and just make sure you step away when it's coming out. Other than that, the best practice for everyone in the raid is to make sure that they're always moving and avoiding fonts just before and just after a jolt casts, because that's really the time that an errant font hit will kill somebody. Otherwise, most people will be full health throughout most of the fight, so a font hit here or there is not going to kill them at all. It's not a huge deal. But around jolt, the combination is very deadly, so make sure you watch for those around that time. So I think that really covers everything for Heroic Dark Animus. It's definitely the most difficult fight that we've faced thus far, through this tier anyway. So be prepared for a lot of very short attempts and a lot of wipes. But again, if you get down that initial opener, once your strategy's settled on, and you get Dark Animus to only gain maybe 1 or 2 extra energy on that opener, that's perfectly fine. As long as you do that, and then you kill the 2 larges after siphon number 4, you'll have more than enough time to kill the boss off before he gains 100 energy. So don't focus so much if you get an extra energy or 2 early on before the first siphon, or after the first siphon rather. That's not that important. Again, every extra energy, as I discussed in the distribution part, is essentially 10 extra seconds that you would otherwise have at the end of the fight. So it's not a huge deal. So if he gains 3 extra energy in the first 1 or 2 siphons because you just weren't fast enough, that's only 30 seconds of lost time off the 400 potential. So it's not the end of the world if you make a few minor mistakes like that. As long as you have the overall majority of it handled and you do the larges after siphon 4, everything else was just a matter of surviving, dealing with matter swaps and jolts. Anyway, that's it. So, as always, good luck, and thank you for watching.